Hey, so I wanted to show you what happens when I disconnect one capacitor. I will do this step with all of them eventually, but I have removed it from after the fuses. It's now here connected to the cables, and the amp clamp is here on the input just to see the spikes. And as you can see, now the capacitor is connected and we have a peak-to-peak value of 5.7 amps, and when I disconnect it you will see the spikes go up, and the peak-to-peak value is now 6.4, and I connect it again now and it goes down, and I disconnect it and it goes up, connect it and it goes down. Alright, so the next test is with the AC capacitor, and this is rather interesting. When I disconnect this one, and it's on the input-output of the coil, so it's AC, and the clamp is still on the input, DC input from the power supply. And if you take a look here, when I disconnect it, and you see the peak-to-peak amperage is now roughly 5.8. Now we'll take it away now, and the peak-to-peak is now 5.1. So the AC capacitor actually makes the spikes larger. And if I disconnect this one again right now with the AC capacitor disconnected, we can see it goes from 5 amps peak to peak to 6 amps peak to peak. So apparently this capacitor is good for spikes, this one is bad for spikes. More to come. So continuing my testing, and this is really interesting. I find it really interesting. When I disconnect the capacitor on the DC side of the rectifier, this happens. Check it out. We have right now a peak-to-peak value of 3.4, and you see the spikes, and I disconnect the capacitor on the DC side now, and the spikes are gone. I connect it, I take it away, I connect it, I take it away, and the peak-to-peak goes from 1 amp to 3.5 amps. Very interesting. Continuing soon. So the next test I'm doing is that I have the capacitor on the DC side of the rectifier disconnected, and I have the AC capacitor disconnected, and there are no spikes, and I now disconnect the capacitor after the fuses, and I do that now, and nothing happens. Nothing. Connected, disconnected, connected, disconnected. So there's some strangeness going on. It's like they work together, the capacitors. So continuing soon. So I have moved the amp meter to the wire going to from the coil. So it's now showing the AC coming to and from it. It's DC coupled at the moment, and nothing happens here when I disconnect the capacitor after the fuses. I can't really see any difference at all. And that is the same for everything. Connecting this doesn't change anything. Connected, disconnected, connected, disconnected. So yes, moving on. Okay, so now I have one wire going to the load and one wire going to and from the coil. It's DC coupled, but it looks the same when it's AC. It just moves it down a bit, and there you go. We can have it on AC, and right now there are two capacitors connected. It's this one after the fuses, and I'm going to disconnect that now, and I can't see any difference really. Disconnected, connected, and if I right now it's the capacitor on the DC side of the rectifier is connected, and check this out. When I disconnect that one, it's now disconnected, and you have the spikes, and it's connected, and the peak to peak is 1.2 when it's connected and 1.7 when it's disconnected. So I guess it's a give and take. And if I connect the AC capacitor, you can see the bottom here, the lowest part, it changes. So now it's disconnected, and now it's connected. Disconnected and connected. Disconnected and connected. Yes. So it seems like I will connect two capacitors in parallel after the fuse and see what it does on the input. Coming back. Okay, so the amp clamp is on the input directly from the power supply, and you can see the spikes. I'm now disconnecting the capacitor on the DC side again, and ta-da! The spikes are gone. And if I now connect the capacitors after the fuse in parallel, it looks like this. And if I disconnect all of them, nothing happens. So this is with no capacitor connected, and this is with two of them in parallel. Interesting. And if I move the clamp to one wire on the load, it looks like that. So we have small spikes, and I disconnect the capacitors after the fuse, and there's really no change. If I connect the two red wires, one from the coil and one to the load, we have some spikes, and nothing really happens. So I guess that the capacitors aren't needed. I will continue.